to wind its way through this country. It's an amazing sight, a small cedar.
We continue to have differences with the Cuban government. We will continue to stand up for human rights, but we address these issues through diplomatic relations and increased commerce and people-to-people ties.
Well, a big part of any conversation about Cuba's economy is the U.S. embargo. Our correspondent Owen Fairclough has been looking into it. Owen?
The Cuban population. That's why its elimination will be essential to normalize bilateral relations.
The man the embargo was built to destroy died peacefully in his bed in 2016. He was 90 years old. He had outlasted 10 American presidents, 7 CIA directors, and 65 years of the most sustained economic blockade in modern history. His name was Fidel Castro. The weapon designed to remove him was the U.S. embargo on Cuba. And today, 65 years after it was signed into law, that weapon is still in place. But here's what nobody is talking about. Cuba's economy is collapsing right now in ways that have no modern precedent. The average Cuban salary in 2025 was $15 a month. GDP per capita has fallen below Haiti's. The economy has shrunk 15% since 2020. Power outages run 20 to 25 hours a day in some provinces. Airlines have stopped flying there because planes can no longer refuel on the island. And almost none of it has to do with the embargo. It has to do with oil. And the oil just ran out. This is the story of the 65-year weapon. How it was built, why it failed, what Cuba actually was before all of this, and what comes next for the world's last frozen market. Section 1. What Cuba was before. Before the revolution. Before Castro. Before the embargo. Cuba was one of the most prosperous countries in the Western Hemisphere. In 1958, the year before the revolution, Cuba ranked 5th in Latin America in per capita income, 3rd in life expectancy, 2nd in per capita ownership of automobiles and telephones, 1st in the number of television sets per inhabitant. The literacy rate of 76% was 4th highest in Latin America. Cuba ranked 11th in the world in doctors per capita. Research by economists Mariel and John Devereaux found that Cuba's living standards in the 1950s were comparable to countries like Italy, higher than Ireland, Austria, Japan, and Spain in per capita terms. Havana was one of the most glamorous cities in the world. Frank Sinatra performed there. Ava Gardner vacationed there. A 1956 tourism magazine described Havana as a mistress of pleasure, the lush and opulent goddess of delights. But the picture was complicated. This prosperity was concentrated. A wealthy urban elite in Havana lived extraordinarily well. Rural workers, particularly in the sugar fields, and Afro-Cuban communities experienced a very different Cuba. Poverty, limited health care, and no political voice. Batista's government was corrupt, deeply tied to American business interests and organized crime. That inequality, the gleaming Havana skyline visible from the date roads of the provinces, is what made the revolution possible. Castro did not topple a paradise. He toppled a country with paradise on its surface and profound injustice underneath. What he built instead turned out to be worse for almost everyone. Section 2. What the embargo actually was. Here is what most people get wrong about the Cuba embargo. At its origin, it was not an ideological statement about communism or freedom. It was a property dispute. In 1960, Fidel Castro nationalized $1.8 billion worth of American business assets on the island. Oil refineries owned by Standard Oil, telephone networks owned by ITT, sugar mills, hotels, banks. The U.S. government's first response was not a speech. Eisenhower cut off oil exports to Cuba. Castro retaliated by nationalizing the 3 remaining American oil refineries. Eisenhower banned all U.S. exports except food and medicine. On February 3, 1962, President Kennedy signed the knee total trade embargo into law. The stated goal, economic pressure, would topple Castro's government within months. That was 65 years ago. Section 3. The Cold War and 13 days that almost ended everything. The calculation in Washington was rational. Cuba's economy was small and dependent on American trade. Remove the trade, the government falls. There was just one problem. The Soviet Union had a different plan. Within months of the embargo, Soviet oil was flowing into Havana. Soviet trade replaced American trade. Soviet military advisors arrived on the island. Cuba had become Moscow's foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a listening post 90 miles from American soil. The embargo did not topple Castro. It drove him into Moscow's arms. And then, in the summer of 1962, the Soviets took it a step further. Khrushchev began secretly shipping ballistic missiles to Cuba, medium and intermediate range nuclear weapons capable of striking most of the eastern United States within minutes. By October, an American U-2 spy plane photographed the construction of missile sites across the island. Kennedy was briefed on October 16th. What followed were 13 days that brought the world closer to nuclear war than it has ever been before or since. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade. He called it a quarantine around Cuba and demanded the Soviets remove the missiles. Soviet ships were already en route. The entire U.S. military went to DEFCON 2, one step below nuclear war. Strategic bombers were kept in the air around the clock. Submarine commanders had orders that under certain conditions authorized launching nuclear weapons. On October 27th, later called Black Saturday, a U.S. U-2 was shot down over Cuba. An American naval vessel dropped practice depth charges on a Soviet submarine whose commander, believing war had already started, nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. Only the intervention of a second Soviet officer on board prevented it. One man stood between the world and nuclear war, and almost nobody knew his name for decades. On October 28th, Khrushchev backed down. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles. In exchange, Kennedy privately agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey and pledged never to invade Cuba. The crisis ended, but it permanently cemented Cuba's place at the center of the most dangerous geopolitical standoff in human history, and it ensured that the embargo, now carrying the full weight of Cold War nuclear anxiety, would be almost impossible to lift. For the next 30 years, the USSR subsidized the Cuban economy at roughly $5 billion a year. Cuba became Moscow's base, its intelligence hub, its partner. The embargo didn't weaken Castro. It made him indispensable to the Soviets. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Cuba collapsed with it. The Cuban government calls what followed the special period in time of peace. Economists call it one of the fastest peacetime economic contractions in modern history, GDP falling 35% in 3 years. Cubans rationed food. Bicycles replaced cars. Lights went out across the island every night. The U.S. tightened the embargo further with the 1996 Helms-Burton Act. Castro survived. He governed for another 15 years. Section 4. Raúl and the Venezuelan Lifeline. In 1999, Hugo Chavez became president of Venezuela, an ideological ally of Castro sitting on one of the largest oil reserves on Earth. In 2000, the two countries struck a deal. Cuba sent doctors, teachers, and military advisors to Venezuela. Venezuela sent oil, eventually up to 95,000 barrels a day at preferential prices amounting to a massive ongoing subsidy. The Soviet lifeline had been replaced with a Venezuelan one. Cuba's economy stabilized. Tourism grew, hitting 4.7 million visitors in 2018. Fidel Castro handed power to his younger brother Raúl in 2008. And here is where the story gets more nuanced. Raúl Castro was not Fidel. He was quieter, more pragmatic, and genuinely interested in reform. Where Fidel governed through charisma and ideology, Raúl governed through institutions. Under his leadership, Cubans were allowed to own mobile phones and home computers for the first time. He abolished the expensive exit visa that had trapped Cubans on the island for decades. He expanded self-employment and small private enterprise. And most significantly, he was the Cuban leader who sat across from Barack Obama in 2014 and agreed to normalize relations, the most significant diplomatic opening in 50 years. Raúl kept his promise to step down after 2 terms. In April 2018, he handed the presidency to Miguel Díaz-Canel, the first non-Castro to lead Cuba since the revolution. Raúl remained party secretary until 2021. In May 2026, the U.S. indicted Raúl Castro on murder and conspiracy charges, a move that effectively ensures he will never leave Cuba and signals Washington's continued posture toward the island. Fidel died in November 2016, at 90. He had outlasted 10 American presidents and the stated purpose of the longest economic embargo in modern history. The embargo had been designed to remove him. He died of old age. The embargo remained. Section 5. The Thaw and the Reversal. In December 2014, President Obama and Raul Castro appeared simultaneously on television to announce the normalization of diplomatic relations, the first direct talks in more than 50 years. The U.S. Embassy in Havana reopened in 2015. American Airlines began direct flights. Marriott and Starwood applied for hotel licenses. Google signed agreements for internet infrastructure. American cruise ships docked in Havana Harbor. The investment community stirred. Cuba represented something genuinely rare, an entire untouched market. Colonial architecture intact, world-class beaches, an educated population, 90 minutes by air from the U.S. East Coast, a market legally frozen for half a century. Then the 2016 election happened. The Trump administration reversed the normalization. Travel restrictions returned. Cruise ships were ordered to stop docking. By 2025, maximum pressure had imposed the tightest restrictions since Kennedy. Oil tankers sanctioned. Foreign companies warned off. An executive order threatening tariffs on any country supplying Cuba with oil. The thaw had frozen over. Section 6. The 2026 collapse. And then Venezuela fell. On January 3rd, 2026, U.S. forces captured Nicolas Maduro. The Venezuelan government collapsed. The oil pipeline to Cuba was cut. Venezuela, which at its peak had supplied Cuba up to 95,000 barrels a day, went to zero. Cuba had no backup. The island produces only about 1/3 of its own oil needs. Venezuela had been supplying another third. Mexico had stepped in as a secondary supplier in 2025, but Trump's executive order threatening tariffs on countries supplying Cuba with oil caused Mexico to halt shipments too. As of January 2026, Cuba had received just one 85,000 barrel oil shipment. Estimates warned fuel could run dry entirely by mid-February. The consequences cascaded fast. Power outages running 20 to 25 hours a day got worse. Airlines restricted service because planes could no longer refuel on the island. Hotels began shutting down and relocating tourists. Jamaica announced it would not renew its medical cooperation agreement with Cuba, eliminating another significant source of foreign currency. Tourism, which had crashed from 4.7 million visitors in 2018 to 1.8 million in 2025, faced complete collapse. The numbers are stark. Cuba's GDP per capita in 2025, $1,082. The regional average, $10,212. The economy has contracted 15% since 2020 and is projected to fall another 6.5 to 7.2% in 2026, making Cuba the worst performing economy in Latin America and the Caribbean. Worse than Haiti, this crisis, unlike the special period of the 1990s, has now dragged on for 6 consecutive years over an already weakened economy with no recovery in sight. Trump, when asked about Cuba, said there will be no more money or oil going to Cuba. Zero. Section 7. The trillion-dollar question. Here is the part the news channels are not covering. When Cuba opens, and the question is no longer whether, only when, what does that market actually look like? Cuba has roughly 500 miles of pristine Caribbean coastline legally off-limits to American hotel development for 65 years. The Dominican Republic, which opened to American tourism in the 1980s, now generates $10 billion a year in tourism revenue. Cuba's natural endowment is comparable and entirely untouched. Agriculture. Cuba currently imports 60 to 70% of its food. Under normal trade conditions, American agricultural exporters would capture a significant share of that market within years. Telecom. Cuba has among the lowest internet penetration rates in the Western Hemisphere. The market is essentially greenfield for U.S. technology companies. Real estate. American corporations had their property nationalized in 1960. Unresolved claims with 65 years of accumulated interest now total over $8 billion. Any normalization agreement requires resolving those claims. Marriott still holds the hotel licenses from the Obama era, ready to activate the moment restrictions lift. Analysts have placed the total investment opportunity in a normalized Cuba north of $1 trillion. The risks are real. The Helms-Burton Act can only be lifted by Congress, not by presidential order. Property rights remain deeply unresolved. A single election can reverse years of progress. But the pattern across history is consistent. Every major market opening, China in 1979, Vietnam in 1995, rewarded investors who positioned early. The people waiting first in line when Cuba opens are not idealists. They are real estate firms, hotel chains, and agricultural exporters who have been running the numbers since 1962. Before the revolution, Cuba was one of the most prosperous countries in the Western Hemisphere. Comparable living standards to Italy, Havana one of the great cities of the world. The revolution promised to fix deep inequality. It delivered a different kind of poverty, equally distributed. The embargo was designed to end the revolution quickly. It lasted 65 years, outlived the man it targeted, and along the way came within one naval officer's decision of triggering nuclear war. The Soviet lifeline replaced American trade. The Venezuelan lifeline replaced the Soviet one. Now the Venezuelan lifeline is gone, and the people of Cuba, who had no voice in any of these decisions, are living with the consequences. Average salary, $15 a month. Power for a few hours a day. Planes that cannot refuel. 6 consecutive years of economic contraction with no floor in sight. 65 years. One weapon. And the people it was supposed to liberate are the ones paying the price. Drop it in the comments. Do you think Cuba opens under this administration or the next? Because the timing of that answer is worth $1 trillion to the people already positioned to answer it. Subscribe to Stag Research if you want to keep following stories like this. The geopolitical systems that shape markets, economies, and the world we'll live in.